Welcome to episode 16 of Mina Talks. I'm your host, Mina. Thanks for joining me in my haunted library. In this episode, I'm presenting a story I wrote for St. Patrick's Day named Iníon Clíodhna. I'm sorry it has taken me so long to get this to you, but the story literally took this long before I finished it in my mind. I didn't want to present it to you unfinished. In addition, I've been rather sick since January. Before I present this, I want to apologize to all of those Irish and Celtic listeners and my ancestors on that side of the family. I have tried very hard to make sure I pronounce the words correctly, but I'm not sure I have. I have used names from both Irish and Celtic mythology with a mixture of my own imagination. For those of you who understand the title, Iníon Clíodhna, you have your first clue as the subject of this story. For those of you who don't, you'll learn what it means within the story. I will warn you the main character has been told stories about her life which are not true. However, she is unaware of that for most of the story. Since the story is mostly told from her point of view, you are informed of what she believes. I feel there may be more for the main character. Okay, there is more for the main character, but you'll learn about that later. Now, let me whisper in your ears. Standing near the cliffs of Moher, looking towards Galloway Bay, my long curly red hair blew in the wind behind me. My green eyes looked across the land, shining as the emeralds of the isle of my birth, as the sapphire water of the bay contrasts against it. I felt the material of my skirt wrapping around my legs. As the sun started to set before me, I wrapped the shawl around my upper body. It told me it was time to head back to the house. I looked down at the dagger in my hand. It was still sheathed, but I could feel the cold metal of the hilt. Letting go of the shawl on one side, I slid the sheath into the waist of my skirt under the shawl, putting my hand back to hold my shawl. I turned to the southeast to head towards Ennis. I would reach my home far before I got there, but it was the closest village. By the time I reached the house, the sun was down. Night had taken over the land. Darkness surrounded me as I unlocked the door and opened it. When I closed the door again, I was still enveloped in darkness. I was alone. The rising creatures of the darkness of night were locked out of the house. The cold iron knife buried under the threshold completed the lock against them. The door frame and door, like the windows of the small house, were encased in cold iron. Nights of darkness without candles for light had taught me how to move around the house in the dark, almost as if I could see. Moving towards the table by memory, I found the candle on the table and lit it quickly. As the light filled the mudroom, I was able to take off my boots and slip on my slippers before moving into the house proper. I headed directly to the hearth to restart the fire I would need to cook and warm the house as the cool spring night moved in. I suspected he was at the pub and would be for a while still. I was home and had to have his meal ready when he walked in the door. Once the fire was going, I lit more candles to light the room before preparing the leg of lamb seasoned with rosemary. Once that was cooking, I went to work on the steak and Guinness pie, knowing I had hours to prepare the food. I would continue by making cocaine and soda bread and rhubarb tart. All of the leftovers would be put on ice for future meals. Most nights, when he was at the pub, I would feed myself, then wait till he returned. This evening was no different. Hours later, he came stumbling in drunk, half singing a drinking song as he wandered into the kitchen to the table. I woke as he slammed the door to the mudroom. I had his plate served and in his place before he crossed the kitchen. He almost stumbled into his chair as he sat. I poured his drink before I went to fix my own plate. Once I had both our plates served, I sat then bowed my head for him to speak grace. My shawl was tied around my upper body, still hiding the sheathed dagger. We started eating, him rapidly scarfing down the food while I slowly ate mine. I used to watch him eat, but I didn't anymore, especially when he was drunk. Since I served him more than I did myself, I finished first. I sat waiting for him to finish with my hands in my lap. He finished before leaning back in his chair. "St. Patrick brings us the bounty of the land. We be finishing the planting on the morrow," he said, slurring his words from the drink. "Join me by the hearth when you finish, lass." I nodded, mumbling my answer, knowing he was already headed into the other room. It never took me long to clear the food into the icebox. I was able to get things safely tucked away for the night. I knew by the time I made it to the other room he would be asleep. When I made it to the hearth, he was indeed asleep. I stoked the fire to keep the March chill from taking over the house. Before doing anything else, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked. After, I took my time walking into my bedroom to change into my nightdress. Then I came back out to check on him. He was completely out with the drink. I knew he wouldn't wake till morning. Quietly, I moved to pull an afghan around him as he slept, then made it to my bed. I had hidden the dagger under my pillow when I changed. I laid down to pull the sheet and blanket over me. As I turned to look out the closed window, the banshee had been wailing her song outside of every night of the last week. I was waiting for her to appear again this night. I knew from seeing the puka in the glen it would be soon. I'm not exactly sure when I fell asleep, but I woke in the darkness to the wailing banshee again. Opening my eyes, I looked out the window to see her starting to take form, slightly above me on the outside of the window. Her wailing song was so sad and pain-filled, I could feel my eyes tearing up. I wondered if my mother saw her before she died. She waved her arms and nodded her head as she wailed. The black and silver glimmering of her form floated in a dance of sorrow. My hand reached under my pillow for the hilt of the dagger. The silver was cold and hard, but it gave me strength. I didn't pull it out yet. I wasn't sure it was the time. The banshee danced closer to my window. She pointed behind her, then back at me. I felt the coldness taking hold of my body. I wondered what she was pointing at. She pointed behind her, then back at me, beckoning me to her to see what she was pointing out. Slowly I pulled the dagger, still sheathed, from under the pillow. The banshee looked from me to the dagger. Her form moved away from me as she danced, while continuing her wailing song. I stood looking at her from the side of the bed farthest from the window. I knew the cold iron window was some protection, but not sure how much it would afford me if I was her target. I moved to the end of the bed as I put the dagger in front of me. She shook her head as she wailed and moved back slowly from the window. By the time I made it to the window, she had floated into nothingness. I looked up the road where she pointed to find it empty as well. I guess what she was pointing at had left with her. The dagger had been the defense I had been told it would be, at least for tonight. The next day I worked in the field to get the rest of our vegetables and other plants in the ground. I had the dagger strapped under my skirt around my waist. We aren't farmers, but the garden provides food for us, with the little extra that he sold occasionally. We traded with some of our neighbors for meat in between market trips. Our main support was the carpentry work he did. I did a little house cleaning and cooking for some elderly persons in our area. There weren't many, but it gave me spending money and something to do when he was gone for weeks at a time on jobs. He was usually gone for 3 weeks or more at a time. When I was little, he would take me with him. But as I was able to be left alone to upkeep the house, he started leaving me at home. Usually when he was gone, his best friend and our nearest neighbor, Connor, would come and check on me once a day as a favor to him. When we finished planting, he left to go to the pub. I made sure the new plants were watered before I went into the house to clean up. I had the rest of St. Patrick's Day to myself. I knew he wouldn't be back for at least 2 days. It was normal behavior for him since I had reached my teen years, especially with St. Patrick's Day. I took out some of the leftover meal from the night before to eat for lunch. After cleaning up the house from the night in the morning, I went into my room. I started working on a new skirt I needed to finish, but I ended up falling asleep in my chair. The lack of sleep and the work of the morning had worn me out. When I woke, the sky was already darkening from late afternoon. I sighed as I put my sewing aside. I took care of my evening chores before I took out the last of the leftover meal for my dinner. Cleaning up after my meal, I stroked the fire to separate it so it would die out. Moving around the corner to my room, I took several logs from beside the hearth with me to put in mine. There was no need to keep the one in the living room hearth going with him gone all night. Setting some of the kindling in the hearth, I set some logs over it before lighting the fire for me. I left the dying fire in the living room alone as I checked the doors and window locks while putting out the candles in the rest of the house. I sat on my chair watching the fire for a few moments after I finished. In all honesty, I knew he had wanted a boy to carry on his name. A son could be taught carpentry while helping him with his work. Sometimes I wish that was possible too. It might have been much better. Perhaps he would have been happier. My mother had died giving birth to me, so there was no chance for a boy with her. He never showed fancy to another. I had lost my sense of time watching the flames while drifting off to sleep until I heard the wailing song again. I turned to the window. I knew what I would see, but I looked anyway. There was a black and silver figure floating in her dance towards me on the other side of the window. I felt a strange pull to the window as I moved my hand to touch the dagger's hilt under my shawl. This night, the finger of the banshee was beckoning me immediately as she sang her wailing song and danced. I was the only one home. Was her wailing song of sorrow for me or for him? Was she telling me he wouldn't return home from his St. Patrick's Day revelry? I knew she could see the hilt as my shawl moved aside, but it didn't deter the banshee on St. Patrick's evening. Nor could I fight the draw of the dance she beckoned me with. I guessed it was well after midnight from the height of the moon as I reached the windowsill. I was so mesmerized by her this time, I couldn't fight her call. I didn't know why then, though I've since learned more of the Tuatha De Danann. It was a strange, sad smile that took her lips as she continued her sorrowful song. To the left, another figure started to float towards the window. She was black and silver like the other banshee, but a gold outline seemed to move around her as she joined the wailing song. There was a difference between them I would learn about later, as I felt her call stronger than the first. I didn't see the co.ag bar coming down the path towards the house on the right behind the first banshee. The original banshee seemed to bow to the new one as she softened her voice, giving the new banshee lead in their song. I started to sway with their song and dance. The mud walls and cold iron case glass were the only things keeping them from me at the moment. Suddenly I could hear the words of the song they sang. St. Patrick's Day has called for you for many a year, yet the Father who guards your soul has stood to keep you safe with all his Tuatha De Danann guards and spells. Yet he leaves you alone on this night, with only a silver-crested dagger to guard you, my poor Caitlin. The use of my name broke the spell momentarily. I pulled the dagger from my waist, holding it up to them defensively, waiting for them to come closer and attack. I don't know what you want with me, but I'll not be coming with you, I said, steadying myself. Now get you on out of here. The new banshee moved closer as she dismissed the one I was used to. It was then I recognized her visage from what I had heard of the tales of old. It was Clíodhna, the queen of the banshees of the Tuatha De Danann. I couldn't figure what she meant or what she had want of me. I looked around as I pulled the dagger from the sheath, revealing the ornate silver of the hilt and blade. I knew any banshee, especially Clíodhna, would know what the blade was. The dagger had been given to me to protect me from any of the fairy people of my homeland. I had sought it out after the banshee had started singing to me at night. Now I stood here facing Clíodhna, with the lesser banshee behind her looking up the lane. I tried to use it as a shield. From the corner of my eye I saw Gancan and his silent black coach, the Coach de Bar. They were determined they would be taking me on this night. "I don't know what you want with me," I started to say again, but I was cut off by her hand as she moved closer to the window. "You know who I am, my poor Caitlin?" "Yes, I know who you are." "Say my name then, child." I swallowed. I'd been raised to never say her name aloud. He told me if I did, it would be like calling her to take away my soul. I would not give it to her without more reason, as it may be my last protection. Instead I said, "I won't." "Do you fear for your soul, my Caitlin? For it's already spoken for," she said as she stopped finally, so close to the window the cold iron sills could almost touch her. A slight mist or smoke seemed to rise from the sills themselves. "Do you know what this night is?" I nodded slowly. I don't know why, but I suddenly believed her words more than any he had taught me. She smiled a bit, bidding me silently to tell her. I answered, saying, "'Tis the night of my birth." "Yes, it is. Did he tell you the words that were spoken at your birth?" This was something he had never told me. I knew what she was speaking of only because I'd heard it whispered of by others when they didn't know I was able to hear. Generally, the elders I cared for in his absence would speak of how sad and wrong it was that he would leave me alone so much given the words of the midwife at my birth. I remember one of the older men saying it was likely he hurt every time he looked at me, while I grew more and more to look like my mother. I could feel my eyes tearing as I thought of those whispers, while shaking my head. "He never told you. But you have heard it, haven't you?" she said, watching me. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He moved you to County Clare from County Cork and Kerry, but he couldn't pull you out of Munster with his heart. You still have the land of your birth and your blood under your feet. What does it matter if you wish to take me from it now that I've reached 17? Am I not to know a love of my own or hold my own child in my arms?" I said, my voice a little stronger as my anger and fear gave me some form of courage. "Is your hatred of him so much that I must suffer too?" She placed her hands on the glass of the window, making me feel all the protections I had were for nothing. I wondered again if the dagger would protect me or not. The dagger was supposed to belong to the fairy Queen Anya, the Linensid Hay venerated in Westminster as a goddess many decades before my birth. The silver was a medal of the moon. It was thought that she had the dagger made to keep her men from the banshee for as long as she could by killing them with it. Now I held it out in front of me towards her, trying to protect myself from the two banshees at my window and the coach below. "It isn't hatred of him which caused me to bring you home where you belong. Him I loved more than any before, but he couldn't stand you wouldn't know how to live a mortal's life before it was your turn to learn of your birthright. 'Tis love of you," she said, her eyes looking from the dagger to me. Her sing-song voice continued with the words I'd heard from the elders' whispers before. "A rainbow lies an air of fire shall light 17 years, as the mortal love of Clíodhna shall teach her of life. But upon St. Patrick's at the end of that 17th year will bring Clíodhna to claim her for to teach her of the dead." My eyes were filled with tears hearing the words from her voice. I could barely hold the dagger, so much so that I had to switch to hold it with both hands. "I'm not leaving. I don't wish to know of the dead," I said softly, but as loudly as my voice would allow. He's had you long enough. He's neglected you and left you alone too much. It's not your fault he's not taken advantage of the boon I gave him. It's time to teach you not only what he should have, but of death as well. Come, my Caitlin, don't make this harder than it has to be. Why does it have to be at all? Oh, child, you were never meant for this world. You belong with us. You're one of us as he was one of us. It isn't just your soul coming with us, but your whole being. Do you not understand? Confusion filled me. I didn't understand. She wasn't here to kill me or just take my soul. The coach was taking all of me? Body and soul? Is that possible? I wondered, realizing how confused and conflicted I was. She wailed loudly as she spun in the air. There was something so painful she couldn't express it any other way. It brought me to my knees. The other banshee was pained by her queen's cry and responded with her own wailing, which only softened as Clíodhna's did. He insisted on being made mortal before your birth cries were made. Sintana, be cursed for the wrong he has done you, my Caitlin. I promise you he shall pay. No, you shan't do anything to him. Please, I'll go with you and not disobey, but he must never be hurt. It'll hurt him enough to lose me. She looked at me in disbelief. She couldn't understand how he would hurt from my disappearing. All she could see was how absent he had been in my time with him. But I knew, even as a young child while I sat next to his workbench as he worked, I knew how much I was loved by this man whom I called my father. Perhaps it would have been kinder for me to have ended his life before this day, but I couldn't make myself do the deed. I'd had my chance the night before as he slept, but I stayed my hand. You will not protest? Will you promise me he will not be harmed? There will be no hand of mine to cause him pain, as long as you fulfill your place, she said, her hand pressing more on the glass, which creaked under her pressure. From what you say, there's no reason for me to try to escape, nor is there hope either. My Caitlin, you shall have all you desire with us. There's so much you don't even know of at this time. Come, open the window and let us go. I moved to the window, still holding the dagger in my left hand as I put my right hand on the glass where hers pressed against the other side. It was then that I realized her hand was corporeal, at least enough to press on the glass. My left hand ran the dagger slowly down my arm without cutting the skin. I put it back in the sheath before I unlocked the window to allow her access, breaking the protection the cold iron had always afforded me and my father. As she crossed the sill to touch the floor before me, she was a beautiful corporeal woman in a black, silver, and gold gown. She seemed scared to actually touch me now that she could. I stood looking at her, unsure of what I should say or do at this point. I'd given my word to obey her. I was bound by that. 17 years I've waited for this, she said, standing before me. Now I can barely believe it's true. You are coming home. You will have everything you were meant to have. I promise all is to be yours. I nodded, my tears falling down my cheeks slowly. She moved her finger to touch the tears on my cheek. There'll be no more need for tears from now on, my Caitlin. She didn't need my answer. It was like she knew it as I thought it. She took my hands with barely a glance at the dagger and lifted me out the window. She was still corporeal as she floated me down to the coach. Canan's eyes watched us as we entered the coach, from where his head sat next to his body on the coachman's box. It was unnerving and frightening. Then the coach de bar was not meant for the living. We entered to sit side by side in the death coach as it moved down the lane away from the only home I'd ever known, then into the sky to the other world. There's so much wonderful coming for you, my Caitlin. Your love like you've never thought possible," she said, finally allowing herself to brush my hair with her hands. "My beautiful Caitlin, I've wanted to be with you all these years. I have so many years to make up for. I promise I will. I promise you shall know how much your mother loves you and has missed you all these years." On March the 19th, Setana returned to his small house on the hill, where he had chosen to make a home for himself and his daughter. He entered to find the house quiet and dark. The hearth was out with no candles lit. The curtains in the living spaces were closed to make the house even darker. He felt icy fingers run down his spine. He looked to the bedroom opposite of his. He dropped his packages as he ran into the dimly lit room. The curtains and windows were open, letting the late afternoon light into the room. He gasped as he rushed to the open window while looking around the room. He looked out the open window, screaming out, "Caitlin!" He kept screaming out the window until he had no voice. He staggered back onto her bed, sitting down when he reached it. He knew before his friends who had heard his cries found him in the house. She was gone. She had been claimed back to the Tuatha De Danann. Connor and his son, Shane O'Leary, were in the 4 men who came to his cries. Shane had grown up with Caitlin, being only a year older than her. Truth be told, he was more than a bit sweet on her as well, though Caitlin had no idea of his feelings yet. As Setana gasped with tears in his eyes, telling them as best he could, he said, "Caitlin's gone. She's been taken by Clíodhna." "No, Setana. Someone has taken her. We will get the constable and form a search party to find her. Hopefully she will be unharmed," Connor said to his friend as he tried to comfort him. "Nay," Setana said with his voice cracking as he spoke. He looked around at his friends from the open window, resting his eyes on Shane as he continued. "She's her daughter. I was a fool to think I could have her for more than 17 years. She's been taken away to take her place as Iníon Clíodhna." Shane looked at his father's friend as in a whisper he questioned, saying, "Caitlin is the daughter of Clíodhna?" Welcome to the end of the video. Thank you for listening to the whole story. As I finished the story, I realized I ended the story with a question. However, the question been answered in the story and by the story's title. Knowing Caitlin's true identity, you can all guess there's a long time period that I can play with for her lifespan. Remember, she's not dead at the end of the story. What do you think of the character of Caitlin? What of the other characters? I hope you do have some questions to put in the comments below. Let me know what you think of the story as well as anything else you would like to know. While you're down there, please give the video a like and share it out. If you aren't subscribed, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you're notified when I upload new videos. If you want to further support the channel, I do have a Teespring store with t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, masks, and other things to choose from. I've added the link in the description with other links to my social media, etc. below. So check it out. Get your own Mia swag. All purchases and donations go to make the channel better. I want to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed. I appreciate your faith in me and enjoyment of my content. I love and appreciate all of you. Thank you to everyone who has been so welcoming, supportive, and helpful. Until we meet again, have a wonderful day or night, and be safe.